because one of the final foci of this course is to talk about Armenian activism through history. So how have Armenians tried to raise their voice in different ways about the social hardships and other hardships that they're experiencing in various geographies. So I was going to finish the session where we discussed the art and architecture of the Armenians in India by looking at Joseph Emin. But we decided to delay it to today because we'd already dealt with quite a lot in the last session. And that turned out to be a good idea because actually Misak received an email during the week from an Armenian. No, he wasn't from an Armenian in India. He was from an Indian who was researching about Armenian history, as far as I understood. And he was explaining how he was trying to encourage Armenians to visit India and to play a larger role in preservation of heritage there and improving Armenian tourist levels there too. So I thought we would begin by discussing Joseph Emin and his legacy, and also the legacy in terms of how Indian Armenians are a sort of a silent minority to some extent in England. I've had the pleasure of encountering two Indian Armenians in my life. Once when I was working in the British Library, I was looking at some microfilms and somebody hovered over my shoulder and said, "What's that you're looking at?" And he introduced himself as an Armenian who had lived in India for his whole life, and he was quite an elderly gentleman and incredibly friendly. And the other encounter was when I was learning Western Armenian at SOAS with Krikor Moskovyan. One of my classmates was also a relatively elderly Indian Armenian. And they were just two wonderful people that told me a lot about their earlier livelihoods there. And it's a history that we don't hear about at all really nowadays, except through these chance encounters, as far as I've gathered. On the contrary, a better known figure within the history of Armenians overall is Joseph Emin, although why he's known perhaps is not as a representative of Indian Armenian heritage and culture exactly, but as the sort of birth of Armenian activism and political consciousness. And he's almost taken out of the Indian context to some extent and placed within this historiography of the rise of Armenian nationalism and the political sort of enlightenment that took place after him. As probably you all know, he was from Calcutta, although he was born in Persia, and he was from a illustrious trading family. However, he didn't want to become a merchant himself. Instead, he travelled to England in 1751 to gain an education there. And this is a potentially wonderful subject for a dissertation. I think scholars haven't really gone into Joseph Emin's experience in England at all, as far as I know. And they focus mainly on his the text that he wrote that we'll look at in a moment. So I'd really love a future student to go into his years in England and perhaps to investigate further the Indian merchant community in London in the 18th century. So he actually studied at Woolwich Military Academy and lived in London for 10 years and seems to have had quite far-reaching interactions with a lot of famous figures like Edmund Burke and William Pitt, who was Secretary of State at the time. Then, after this experience in London, gathering sort of Western know-how and political networks, he travelled through the Ottoman Empire and through Persian Armenia, and he visited sort of provincial Armenian areas and villages and interacted with Armenians there, and he was almost like a sort of proto-Armenian revolutionary in that way, in terms of visiting the villages and speaking to people and trying to sort of convince them of a different way of life and sort of breaking free from their shackles on a personal basis, just like the later revolutionary cells would try to attempt to. So anyway, he travelled a fair bit, and he published, what he's really famous for is his sort of autobiography, which he published in 1792, which is available to us, luckily enough, through archive.org, so we can download the whole text. To what extent it was widely read at the time, it's not that clear, but it was certainly enshrined within Armenian historiography as a very important text, as a sort of turning point in Armenian intellectual history. In particular, the author Louise Nalbandian, who's sort of been disparaged nowadays because she had such close connections with the Hunchak party, but nevertheless, she's still a key example of the more traditional historiography that you can hold up, who tended to view the Armenian political development of the 18th and 19th century in terms of stages that led inevitably, or relatively inevitably, to the formation of the Armenian revolutionary movement. So these were stages of enlightenment through which Armenians learnt about European ideas and had access to new technologies of communication, like the printing press. And so they had not only the ideals, but also the tools that they needed in order to disseminate a new political ideology. So these kind of methods and ideas gave rise to a movement for independence that was established through Joseph Emin and his fellow merchants in the Madras colony. This is how the historiography has tended to portray him, as a sort of initial figure in the path of Armenian political enlightenment, the first figure who really started to articulate ideas about Armenian independence and the struggle against foreign oppressors. So Louise Nalbandian, as the quotation here, viewed him as an important first step in pointing out the path for future work, and that future work would be the revolutionary movement of the 19th century, that is the Hunchak party specifically, but also the other revolutionary organizations. So to what extent is this actually present in his writings? So I thought we would look at a couple of excerpts here to see what he was trying to do through his text. So his autobiography, which he published during his lifetime, but it was reprinted in 1918, was called The Life and Adventures of Joseph Emin, an Armenian. And in this, he talks about his experiences in Europe, in London. In this paragraph, actually, he's talking about first how he was exposed to European culture through his observations in India itself and the East India Company, British, that were based in India at the time. And he says, in quotes, "There I saw the thought of the Europeans and the soldiers' exercise and the shipping, and that they were dexterous and perfect in all things. Then I grieved with myself for my religion and my country, that we were in slavery and ignorance." And then he goes on to say, because our fathers did not fight for their country. He goes on to talk at the bottom of the paragraph, I should point up here, at the bottom of the paragraph, to talk about then how he resolved to go to Europe to learn the military art and other sciences to assist that art. And then he would become useful to his country. He said, "I could not bear to live like a beast, eating and drinking without liberty or knowledge." And this is an excerpt from a letter that he sent to the Earl of Northumberland. So this is a sort of insight into his reasons for travelling to London to learn about Western technology and warfare methods, military technology and techniques, as a way of then travelling back to Armenia to implement those technologies there and to eventually liberate Armenia from the Persian yoke or the Ottoman yoke that he viewed to be in place at the time. But of course, it's also how he framed these beliefs when he was communicating them to the Earl of Northumberland. So remember that if these were within correspondence to the British Earl, then he may have been more prone to emphasise his awe for British culture, perhaps in that context than in other contexts. So perhaps these are a bit more of a sort of Europhile expression than he might express in other sources. Here he's talking about his travels to the Ottoman Empire and interacting with Armenians in villages in the Ottoman Empire, and why he felt he needed to liberate them from their situation under the Ottoman yoke. So he exclaims in this excerpt, "Why are you not free? Why have you not a sovereign of your own?" And the answer that they made was, "Sir, our liberty is in the next world. Our king is Jesus Christ." Emin said, "How came that about? Who told you so?" They answered, "The holy fathers of the church, who say the Armenian nation has been subject to the Mohammedans from the creation of the world and must remain so till the day of resurrection. Otherwise we could soon drive the Ottomans out of our country." So this is explaining how he views the Armenians in those villages as sort of sheep without a shepherd, and how they need some kind of guidance in order to liberate themselves from their difficult conditions. And he views himself to some extent as that person who will point them in the right direction. So I'm not sure to what extent he's remembered within Armenian society today, and whether he is as prominent as he is within the historiography of the Armenian political movement, whether he's known in individual households, whether people talk about him, from generation to generation. So I'd be interested to hear about that in the discussion. And I'd also like to talk about, if we can remember when the discussion comes around, the legacy of British Armenians in India today, and what the numbers might be, and how far connections are still held between India, if they still have relatives out there and they still move between Britain and India, and these kind of aspects would be interesting. So yeah, hopefully we can move back. Remember to talk about that in the final section. So that was just a brief sort of footnote to the last session. So now we'll have two sections in which we'll talk about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and in the Russian Empire. So we'll give some background to both of those empires, and then we'll discuss some examples of particularly Armenian cultural producers in the empire. So I forgot to introduce myself to those who weren't here last week. I'm primarily an art and architectural historian, so this course is mainly looking at those kind of visual and material sources to try and sort of revisit or interrogate or think about some of the paradigms in Armenian history and historiography. Because I think there haven't really been that many art and architectural historians who have looked at these periods and have tried to integrate the visual production within the discourse about political change in the 19th century and the rise of the revolutionary movement, and what the social and political situation was of Armenians both in the Ottoman and Russian empires. My background is actually that I trained in art history, and I focused first on the Ottoman Empire, and I worked for a long time on the Ottoman architecture of the 19th century and the role of Armenian architects in the Ottoman architecture of the 19th century. Then, after I finished my PhD, which was on the Balyan family, who were a very illustrious family of Armenian architects in the 19th century in Istanbul, after I finished my PhD on that, I then got a job at a university in Mardin in southeast Turkey, close to the Syrian border. So I spent 3 years there teaching a mixture of Kurdish, Arab and Turkish students, courses on Armenian art and architecture, Orientalism, surveys in art history, all sorts of different things. So that was a wonderful 3 years. And then I moved to the University of Lincoln, where I've been since 2015, and I'm in a Department of History and Heritage there. And so I teach a mixture of courses on Russian history, Ottoman history, and Armenian history. But again, with a very heavy focus on visual sources. So, yeah, I guess I'll start talking about Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. I'll aim to talk for about 40 minutes or something on each of them, hopefully, and then we'll have a brief break and discussion afterwards. So, I'll go back actually to the lesson plan. Here we go. Yeah, so I'll aim to give some background on Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Then I will discuss the 19th century reform movement and cultural westernization and the role of the Armenian community in these changes. And then I will look at provincial Armenians and the difference in culture between those of the imperial capital and in the provinces. Then I'll talk about the political situation, the failure of the reforms in the provinces, and how the cultural production changed in the late 19th century to reflect this changed political context. Then we will change to the Russian context. I'll briefly discuss Persian imperial rule and Persian culture within those geographies, the geography of present-day the nation-state of Armenia, that is. Then I'll discuss the Russian invasion and the Armenian role in the Russian Empire. I won't give you a lot of historical background on either of the empires, so I'll focus more on the visual sources, the cultural production in both of those empires. So if you want any further background reading, then just ask me afterwards and I can point you in the direction of sources. But I apologise for not covering a lot of historical detail and just skipping through some quite important stuff. So instead, as I said, we'll focus on the cultural production and how this reflects both the situation in the empire, each respective empire of these Armenians, and then how this changes to reflect the changing political situation of the late 19th century and the rise of new ideas, realism, romanticism, and the revolutionary movement, and so on. I keep touching that one instead of this one. So, as I already kind of mentioned with Joseph Emin, there tends to be a traditional historiography that has dominated the interpretation of Armenian experiences in the Ottoman Empire for quite a long time, which has tended to stress the idea of the Ottoman yoke, which is that Armenians were second-class citizens. They didn't really achieve powerful positions within the Ottoman Empire, and they certainly weren't able to serve positions in the Ottoman state of any kind of leverage. So there's this idea of the suppression of Armenians so that they were second-class citizens and so that they didn't participate fully in Ottoman state, society or culture. So instead, I think a new generation of historians have started to revisit the way that the Ottoman Empire functioned and the role of the minorities or non-dominant populations within these empires. So they've started to look at empires through sort of sociological lenses and how they function through use of different imperial strategies. For instance, the book on the left is a survey of different empires comparing how they used various imperial strategies. And the image on the right is a book that focuses on the Ottoman Empire that's using these new historiographical tools. So both of these books, that is the book by Burbank and Cooper on Empires in World History and Empire of Difference by Karen Barkey, have stressed how empires like the Ottoman Empire were very successful because of their management of diversity. So that means that they had various policies in place that meant that non-dominant populations served respective roles, and on the whole were relatively content with those roles. They used intermediaries also to their success. So they had individuals within or groups within various communities who served an important role in communicating the desires of the empire to the community and vice versa, as sort of go-betweens between the community and the sultan. They've also, and so Armenians were very crucial to all of these aspects, the management of diversity and serving as intermediaries. And they've also stressed the importance of image making to these empires. So how did these empires present themselves through architecture, through painting, through public ceremonies, and other aspects. And Armenians again were absolutely central to the image making of empires like the Ottomans and also the Russians. The Ottomans in particular, but also the Russians, had a framework for the governance of diversity, which meant that they had certain strategies that had been created more or less since the beginning of the Ottoman Empire that they used to manage the non-Muslim or non-dominant communities. But this framework could be changed at different points depending on whether the Ottoman Empire was under political pressure. So I'll just mention some aspects of the framework that they had in place. Before I go into that, I'm sure you're well aware of the many different populations that lived in the Ottoman Empire, in the territory of the Ottoman Empire. So there was this necessity to successfully manage the diversity of the empire. You had, don't know if there is a pointer. Ah, yes, there is. Aha. So you had, okay, well, you had up here Greeks of the Black Sea, you had various populations in Anatolia, you also had Greeks in the Aegean, you had various Balkan populations here, although they started to break away from the later decades of the 19th century. You had also the Arab provinces and Berber populations in North Africa. So this was an incredibly diverse population that used many different languages and had a mosaic of different cultures that needed to be governed with respect to those differences to some extent. So one of the frameworks that was in place was non-Muslim or Zimmi status, which in theory meant that non-Muslims had limited status in a number of aspects of their dress. So they had, as this image from the Relam Book of Costumes shows, they had certain pieces of costume that they needed to wear in order to demonstrate publicly their identity or their membership to a non-Muslim community. Although in reality we know that these costume regulations weren't necessarily applied. So the reality was that perhaps the regulation of status and displays of status wasn't as strict as some texts indicate. Nevertheless, there were a number of restrictions on displaying status in public, and this included it was difficult to build a new church. Churches generally had to be rebuilt rather than built afresh. Religious ceremonies couldn't be held in public. Display of religious symbols in public was generally forbidden. And there were other aspects like Muslim courts generally had to be used and non-Muslims were inferior witnesses and so on. So as Karen Barkey has stated, these regulations meant that non-Muslims had a separate, unequal, and protected status. So that means that they were separate, they were largely kept within their own religious community. They were unequal in that within a court they were not an equal witness with a Muslim, and they weren't allowed to show their status or ride on a horse in public and so on. But they were protected in that they were allowed to remain Christian, and they weren't largely attacked or waged war on, except due to political circumstances when these frameworks came under pressure. So that's what people like Karen Barkey have argued, that they had these frameworks which created some degree of protection for non-Muslims, but when circumstances could change, when the Ottomans were put under pressure by outside empires and things were destabilized, that was when these things collapsed and they weren't protected any longer. Another part of the framework was, of course, the Patriarchate, which gave some degree of political representation, as well as religious authority, although the extent to which it represented a separate political representation from the Sultan is questionable, because often the Patriarch was quite close to the Sultan, and in particular he was very close generally to the oligarchy of the Armenian community. So genuine political spokesperson he may not have been, but nevertheless he was a sort of symbolic head and represented some degree of political voice. I think I'll perhaps skip over this. This text is about the creation of the Armenian Patriarchate, which you're probably all familiar with the tale that Mehmed the Conqueror, who was the Ottoman Sultan who took Constantinople from the Byzantines in 1453, the account goes, which was published by Mikhail Shamchin in the 18th century, the account goes that Mehmed the Conqueror had appointed Bishop Yovakim, who was the Armenian Bishop of Bursa, to be the Patriarch of Constantinople. And so he moved the Yovakim, the Bishop of Bursa, to Constantinople to be the first Patriarch. That's how the story goes, that was published by Shamchin. And so this is quite interesting, I think, because it creates this idea that the head of the Armenian community, the religious head and political head, was created as a result of the sort of personal favour of Mehmed the Conqueror through choosing this person and moving him to Constantinople to head the church. That's at least according to this account, which implies that he was chosen by Mehmed the Conqueror, who was already his friend. And he also relocated a number of eminent Armenian families to Constantinople, who then served a role as a sort of oligarchy around the Patriarchate. So from this account you do get a picture that the Armenian community was quite close to the Sultan from the time of Mehmed the Conqueror, and they had some degree of imperial favour. This situation of imperial favour continues into the 19th century, and some might say that impression of being the Sultan's favoured community and the close relations with Mehmed the Conqueror was actually something that was projected back from the 18th century and the 19th century onto the earlier period, and that it perhaps didn't exist at the time. Because by the 19th century, the Armenians certainly had a really important position, particularly at the courts of the Sultans Mahmud II and Abdul Majid around the middle of the 19th century. So they reached a kind of peak at that period where many were serving as intermediaries. So they were working as the Sultan's bankers, as the head of the imperial mint, as the head of the imperial factories, and also the chief Ottoman architects. So, and the painters of the portraits of the sultans. So it was both in the financial systems and also the systems of imperial representation or image making that Armenians were really dominant in the middle of the 19th century. And again, they were so important in relation to the Sultan and his banking and his image making and so on, that they also had a really important position within the Armenian community as sort of spokespeople of the Armenian community, and they took on a role as a sort of oligarchy over the community. Although they were conservative elites in that they were close to the Sultan, they also, as it says here, they had the potential to steer the community in another direction, as we shall see. So, chief amongst these were a number of Armenian notables called the Amira class. So they were called the Amira class by Hagar Barsumian, who was a historian who was working in Lebanon at the American. I apologize, I tend to use a Turkish or Turkicized spelling of names, and that's purely because I came to these figures through Ottoman studies, not because I'm trying to sort of diminish their Armenianness or anything like that. So, I mean, we can discuss that at the end as well. That would be really interesting to hear different takes on how important spelling is and how, as well, these figures should be sort of categorized as well, whether we should say they're Ottoman Armenian, Armenian Ottoman, whether they have this sort of important dual identity, or whether they should be recognized as singularly Armenian or even just Ottoman. And that's also interesting from the Russian context as well. You have these figures like Ayvazovsky, who are often described as Russian painters, but obviously they're extremely important within Armenian history as well, or even more important. So anyway, this is a church that was rebuilt in 1838. So as I said before, it was quite difficult to get permission to build new churches. So most of the time you had to rebuild churches that were already existing. And even to rebuild those churches, you had to sort of maneuver a bit in order to make sure that the works would go ahead. And in cases like this, where you were rebuilding on a much more lavish scale, you would certainly have to have very close relationships with the Sultan and perhaps supply a few sort of bribes or other persuasions. Because generally it was stipulated within the official Ottoman documents that the churches shouldn't be changed. So it would say they should be exactly the same dimensions and form that they were before when they were being rebuilt. So it's quite striking that these Amiras were rebuilding churches all over Istanbul, all over Constantinople, in a much more lavish form than they had been before. So this one, for instance, has this amazing stucco dome that has these sort of empire-style wreaths and sun rays coming from the wreaths, and they have the Armenian letters, the holy Armenian letters inside the wreaths as well, and some portraits. I think it's a portrait of Christ in the center of the dome, I'm not sure. And then on the walls of the church they also have these monumental paintings that many of them were painted by a painter called Umed Beyzad, who was actually trained under the patronage of Garabed Balian as well. So they were not only repairing these churches in a much more lavish way, but they were also training up a new generation of painters who would fill them with these wonderful new Italianate paintings. So the Amiras were these sort of patrons of a revival in Armenian churches in the 1820s, 1830s. So this was even before the reform period took place. And this is one of the most striking things that I've ever noticed, which no one seems to have noticed before me, to my surprise. But it's a very close relationship of that church that was completely redecorated in 1838 by Garabed Balian, or Karabek Balian, to the mausoleum of Mahmud II, which was built around 1839 at the time of his death. And although the colour scheme is a bit different, obviously, the Beşiktaş church has this blue and white colour scheme, and yellow. The one on the right is totally monochrome. It's nearly all white except for the inscription band there. I, however, see huge similarities in terms of the use of these sunray motifs, the use of wreaths and crests and garlands, the sort of composite or Corinthian capitals that are in the walls, that are engaged in the walls, and these sort of cornices, the stucco cornices that you can see there as well. So there's a lot of decorative similarities between the two buildings that are quite striking for me, and I was quite surprised when I saw these similarities because I thought that they really highlighted this close relationship between Karapet-Balyan and Mahmud II at the time. The fact that Mahmud II wanted his own mausoleum in such similar decorative terms to the church of Strazadzen and Beşiktaş. So I thought this encapsulated this message of the Armenians in the middle of the 19th century as being the sort of the Sultan's favourite subjects. So in the middle of the 19th century you have the reform movement, encapsulated by the Gülhane Decree of 1839, which included clothing reform and centralisation of various government departments. Then that was followed in 1856 under Abdülmecid by the Hatun-Humayun, the imperial rescripts, and this was really significant because of the language of egalitarianism that it promoted. So as this quotation from the reform decree indicates, Armenians and other non-Muslim communities were invited to examine into its actual immunities and privileges and to discuss and submit to my sublime court the reforms required by the progress and civilization of the age. And so the situation that was granted to them by Mehmed the Conqueror in 1453 should be made to harmonise with the new position, that is, with the modern age. So this is this is incredibly progressive language that was being used at the time. Whether or not it was actually followed up by decrees that made any genuine difference is something else that we will come to, but the language certainly changes at this point and promises not equal opportunities, but increased opportunities for non-Muslim subjects that would be in line with the progress and civilization of the modern age. And so one part of this reform is that it made building churches much easier. So we do see in the British consular correspondence, like in this dispatch from 1860, from a consul who was stationed in the southeast area, the consular office that was called the consul for, Aleppo was this one. He describes that churches were built without the least opposition or difficulty in the area of Aleppo by 1860. So already it had quite a quick impact, easing the construction of churches, if nothing else. Whereas previously you had a very long process and you wouldn't actually be able to construct anything new because it would all have to be rebuilt on former structures. So also, in addition to this reform period and the reform bills and the language of egalitarianism, you also have far-reaching cultural change within the Armenian community. You have the travel of the generation of young Armenians, many of whom were the sons of the Amiras, and others were from poorer backgrounds but were sponsored by the Amiras in many cases, and they would travel to, particularly to Paris, but also to Italy, and to attend the finest prep schools and the Grande École in the 1840s and subsequently. So they would travel to study a number of different subjects, from medicine to engineering to architecture to law. But what is significant is that they not only learnt what was being taught in those institutions and so had access to cutting-edge European education, but they were also surrounded by the Latin Quarter at this time, which was of course a political hotbed. So they were experiencing Paris in the Age of Revolutions as well. So one of the results that's sort of emphasized in the Armenian historiography is the formation of the Ararat Society, which included a number of individuals such as Nigos Balyan, Nahakat Rossinian and Krikor-Rodian, and they were engaging in a number of activities to promote educational reform and also language reform in the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire. And they were most significant because they went on to write the 1863 Armenian, what is known as the Armenian Constitution. So access to a Western, European cutting-edge education in this case is interpreted to lead to the rise of nationalism. And historians, again, I'm focusing on Louise Nalbandian because she's the best known example, but there are other people like James Etmekjian who also give a similar description of the 19th century rise of nationalism. So this access to a European education is generally described as giving rise to, as Louise Nalbandian says in this quotation, an ardent love for freedom and a new nationalism which was to turn the people towards unrest and insurrection. So the question remains, to what extent were people like the Ararat Society really intent on a separate Armenia? Was this already the rise in a nationalist intelligentsia, or was this a more sort of liberal opposition, or even a liberal loyal intelligentsia that decided to carry out relatively limited reforms within the Ottoman Empire? So yes, did the experience of revolutionary Paris really have such an effect? So I'll briefly discuss the Balyan family, who, as I said before, I worked on for my PhD. So we already mentioned Karapet Amira, who was the older generation. So his sons, Nigos Bey in the middle, and Sarkis Bey, as well as his brother Agop Bey, they all attended Parisian educational institutions in the 1840s to 1860s. There's sort of differing degrees to which they attended. Some of them just seem to have dropped into some courses without graduating, but I think that's not necessarily that significant. They had access to these technologies and to these ideas. Whether or not they actually graduated, maybe it differs the degree to which they internalized or they took on these techniques, but nevertheless they were still exposed to them. So Nigos in particular was educated at the Collège Saint-Barbe, which was a leading prep school. It's still a leading prep school in Paris. So there he would have had access to education in classics, philosophy, languages, foreign languages, and also drawing techniques. They had a drawing class there. But what is really significant about his experience at the school is that it was a centre for the Romantic architects known as the Neo-Grecs, who were led by Henri Labrouste and Alexandre Labrouste, the Labrouste brothers. And so Alexander Labrouste was the head of the school, and he is noted to have been particularly fond of Nigos Balyan. So we know that there was actually a close connection between these leading Romantic French architects, Neo-Grec architects, and the Balyans, thanks to their attendance at this school. Sarkis Balyan, Nigos' brother, also attended the École Centrale des Arts et Manufacture. I apologise for my French, it's terrible. Where he learnt a number of engineering and building technologies that included modern machinery, methods for building in difficult terrains, various methods of building foundations. Basically, a range of techniques that would help him achieve all the activities that he would later carry out in Istanbul at a period of rapid modernisation. So he would work on, for instance, mining. He would work on the ferry boat companies. He would work on not only architecture, of course, of different kinds, but a variety of engineering and public works activities he went to go on to engage in when he returned. And finally, they were exposed to the École des Beaux-Arts, which gave them new ideas about artistic form at the time, the cutting-edge ideas about artistic form, and the battle of styles that was going on in the 19th century between these, the Gothic style or the classical style or the Neo-Renaissance style. And so they had this idea of playing around with different decorative styles in order to communicate different meanings through those styles. And they had a detailed education in the historical development of styles through various history of architecture courses that they took there. So anyway, how did this translate into their architecture? So the Dolmabahce Palace was constructed primarily by Karapet-Balyan, so by the Amira. So for that reason, it has the relatively limited integration of the more romantic ideas into the architecture. The architecture itself is actually very innovative. You won't be able to see it from here because it's in the ground plan. The facade is this stone facade that's very neoclassical, so it's just this long, sleek facade, both on the entrance facade and also on the sea facade, which hopefully I've got, on this image. So these very long stone facades, which are constructed along the Bosphorus. So already this is quite a massive change for the history of Ottoman palace architecture, because previously in the Topkapı Palace, which was the 16th century Ottoman palace, the palace had been based on smaller kiosks. So to transform that from these smaller kiosks based around courtyard gardens to this huge stone facade that was facing along the Bosphorus so that everybody could see it as they passed along the Bosphorus, this was already quite a fundamental transformation, and it's almost like Peter the Great's construction of his palace along the Neva. This was something that was new, but within this wall, you can't see the ground plan, which I should have put an image of there, but the ground plan is a series of interlocking ground plans that are based on Ottoman Turkish residential architecture. So that behind this smooth facade, there are a number of rooms that interconnect, and each room is based on the traditional unit of Ottoman residential architecture, which was called the sofa, which was a central hall with halls emptying out. Almost like a sort of cross shape. So there are a series of interlocking rooms behind this smooth facade. So it's a real hybrid of traditional Ottoman architecture with this new stone facade and the sleekness of the neoclassical facade. But what was really the reflection of the Parisian education was this stone carving on the exterior. And the stone carving was in relief, so it's really coming out of the facade in 3 dimensions. It's very, very heavy carving, such as you wouldn't see in a European building. And what Negozbalyan was trying to do with this carving, I think, was to create a sort of a wonder, an imaginative wonder through this heavy application of ornament. And in the Armenian obituary of Negozbalyan, which through my amazing luck was recommended to me by Richard Antomarian, who was a scholar who was interacting with me at the time, and he pointed me in the direction of this absolutely mind-blowing Armenian source, which was a long obituary dedicated to Negozbalyan that was published in 1858 when he died. He died prematurely at the age of 1858, and so he became this sort of romantic hero of the Armenian community, and his artistic legacy was enshrined in this very long obituary that was published in this Armenian periodical, Megu, in 1858. And this describes his architectural legacy in the following words: as a follower of the architectural school of Renaissance and Revival, he fortunately got rid of artificial rules and superstitions. He brought a very clear horizon where his beautiful imagination could fly freely. This was a freedom that was based on rationalism that was introduced into the philosophy of Descartes and into the literature by Victor Hugo, and which he encouraged to be introduced into our literature. And so I think here, the way I understand it is that although he used the neoclassical facade that was probably largely mandated by his father, Karapet Balian, he applied this density of ornament to show this imagination flying freely, and this sort of idea of returning to nature and sensory awe that was one of the goals of the Romantic movement. And you can also see it here, I think, in this dome, which is actually the dome to the Ortaköy Mosque, which was built around the same time, about 1853 or 54. And it's also coated on the exterior with heavy stone carvings, but on the interior you have this wonderful painted dome, which is using a new technique which was called trompe-l'œil, which means sort of tricking the eye, because the paintwork seems to be sort of coming out in 3 dimensions at you. It's painted flat, but it's three-dimensional through the light and shade that's being used and through the perspective. So you can see in the dome that it depicts a series of mihrabs. The mihrab was the niche to which Muslims pray. So it depicts a series of mihrabs in the dome that are interspersed with these sort of windows or columns with blue sky behind them. So this, I think, is a sort of symbolic way of communicating that the dome equates to the heavens. But it's through this technique of this decorative overload that, again, Nigos Balian creates, I think, a romantic work where, in quotes, the imagination could fly freely. And this is a technique that he uses on many different works. Okay, so I think I'll go through a bit more quickly and move on to the Russian context. I wanted to briefly mention about the situation in the provinces and cultural difference. From the earliest years of the settlements in the various provinces, there seems to have been a different style that was used in church architecture and also in other modes of cultural production, which reflects local cultural traditions. So Armenian church architecture seems to have been localized in different regions at different times. This is one example that shows such a locally attuned architecture. It is the Cathedral of the 40 Martyrs, which was built in 1491 and then sort of rebuilt in 1616. And I wanted to just draw attention to the extent to which techniques that can be seen in Aleppo's Islamic architecture as well as its Christian architecture can be seen in the church, such as this striped masonry called ablak, mukarnas, which is this stalactite carved technique, which you can see better here. So although there are obviously aspects that are more traditional according to Armenian sort of medieval templates and so on, there's also this decorative assimilation of local identity through styles like ablak and mukarnas, and there's more ablak there. And you can see this right from the the early modern period to the modern period that I study, you can see churches that were built in the 1890s that continue to show considerable uptake of localized styles like this. So I think we'll just briefly mention that in the 1860s, the heightened expectations of the Reform Decree and that language of egalitarianism starts to translate into frustration, because the reforms were disappointingly carried out. They didn't translate into much representation, and many of the new councils that were created in provincial cities actually consisted of the notables who previously held power, so it didn't translate into a new kind of sharing power. It just translated into variations on the old system. So in other words, the language of reform created these heightened expectations that didn't translate into change on the local level that was satisfying. And there were also issues like the double taxation system. They would be taxed by the new administrations, but they would also be taxed by nomadic groups who would be passing by. And there were also issues in terms of Kurds would be settled on land that was already settled by Armenians. So a number of different issues came together. This was made even worse by the Russo-Turkish War, which saw fighting between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire on the territories on the eastern borderlands, such as Bitlis. So these areas saw fighting firsthand. And there were even more frustrating situations with the treaties that promised Russian protection, and then withdrawal happened in reality. So there was an increasing situation where the elites of Constantinople and the sort of guardians of the Armenian people were associated with betrayal by provincial Armenians and disappointment because the reforms hadn't resulted in anything that was satisfactory or any protections. And there are example after example in the British archives just down the road in Kew of the British consuls being approached by Armenian villagers who are being attacked by Kurdish chieftains. So there are pages and pages of these kind of social issues that were being experienced in the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire in the late 1870s to 1890s. There are also, of course, petitions that were sent both to the British consuls but also to the Russian side, and George Brunutian published a range of documents that relate to the Russian consuls who were based in those eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And this is one example. This is actually a petition that was sent to Tsar Alexander III about their deteriorating situation. And they're appealing to Alexander III, who was, of course, the Tsar liberator who got rid of serfdom, and they're appealing to his mighty humanitarian influence to intervene on their behalf. So they were not only petitioning the local consuls and trying to get their sort of engagement, but also these international figures of great significance. And so, because of this situation of desperation, they increasingly turned to more radical tactics. This is a fascinating document that I found once in the archives in Kew. That is a British consul who is stationed in Bitlis, and he encounters a group of revolutionaries that had been holding up the monastery of Arak near Mush, and those revolutionaries included the famous Andranik, and Andranik explains to the consul about his rationale for engaging in these kind of let's say, revolutionary tactics of taking possession of a monastery and fighting off the Ottoman Turkish forces. And he says, in quotes, at the bottom, so this is here where it talks about Andranik of Sivas. So he said very decidedly, in reply to the remark that he and his men were ruining their own people, they wanted justice. Justice, he said, and they had taken up arms because they had lost all hope of obtaining it by peaceful means. They were determined to fight to the death. And the date of this is 1902. And that's interesting because, it's directly from the voice of Andranik speaking to the consul at that time, presence in Russia. So you have a similar movement in Western Armenian painting, in painters from Constantinople, who were increasingly painting figures from the eastern provinces and also villagers from the eastern provinces who had moved to Constantinople. And Vazken Haji Davidian, who many of you, I'm sure, know, who's a member of the community here in London, he's published a fantastic article on this transformation of realist painting in the Armenian community at this time, and how they were trying to raise their political voice in a difficult situation which was obviously dominated by censorship. So how could they raise their voice within the Ottoman Empire with all these difficult situations that they were facing, marauding Kurds, oppression by local administration and so on? Well, they could do it through painting, through drawing attention to the hardships that peasants were experiencing, through painting a Armenian beggar woman from Van, and you can see, the look of exhaustion and desperation on her face, and her ragged clothing, and she's without shoes. How drawing these kind of figures and painting these kind of figures and exhibiting them in Constantinople and elsewhere was a way that they could communicate about the difficult political scenario in a situation of censorship. So then you have the rise of the political parties in the 1880s. The Armenian party, led by Migadic Portukalyan, and then, of course, the Hunchak and Tashnak parties in the late 1880s and 1890s, which were formed abroad in Geneva and Tiflis, respectively, but the ideas started to travel back to the Ottoman Empire in various ways. So the rise of the revolutionary political parties had an impact on visual production through different ideas being communicated, such as the Ottoman state as the oppressor versus the glorification of the people, the peasantry and the poor, meaning the people. So I think that this is quite interesting, this painting by Panos Telemesian from 1905, a shepherd from Lori, as a sort of corresponding image to this quotation from Troshak, which was the newspaper of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation. And it says, in quotes, "By his behavior, the Sultan is convincing everyone that there is no salvation for Turkish Armenia but through revolt." And so you can see in this image by Telemesian how this shepherd boy is clutching his dagger, and he has a sort of a somber look about him, almost as if he has decided to take matters into his own hands. He has a sort of quiet confidence about him in this painting, which may or may not relate to Telemesian's own changing politics. The Revolutionary Party also promoted the idea of people as active agents in the revolutionary struggle. So you start to see images like this one of Arshak Fetvajian, the woman of Sassoon, who shows this Armenian lady of the the area of the highlands of Sassoon, which was a historic stronghold of Armenian nobles. And she's defending this highland through holding this gun and protecting her baby, who she's feeding at the same time, in this very dramatic landscape. Again, with this look of stern determination on her face. And I think, again, that encapsulates these new ideas that the revolutionaries were communicating, like, in quotes, the situation of the Turkish Armenian people is today the sickest, and it's the responsibility of the whole of the Armenian people to cure that disease today. So even, suckling mothers and babies are, it's their responsibility to participate in this struggle. So you also see a number of symbols of national identity being promoted with increasing prominence. So many of these correspond to what Anthony D. Smith has identified in his study of painting in Western Europe and the promotion of national identity in Western European painting. So it's interesting how you can also see similar developments in Armenian painting in the later 19th century. Ideas such as the idea of the chosen people, the role of the Batavian myth or revolt as a time of historical origins, the growth in significance of landscape painting, in particular under people like Wharton-Durgaryan, that we'll look at, and Ayvazovsky, and the emphasis on heroism and sacrifice and works to commemorate suffering. So the Fetvadzian painting is a work to commemorate sacrifice in some ways, and heroism. So this also corresponds to the rediscovery of Ani, which we mentioned in the previous lecture. The excavations were taking place, and so there was a much greater awareness of what medieval Armenian architecture looked like and what medieval Armenian motifs looked like at this time, and for that reason they start to be incorporated much more into the 19th century paintings. So it's not just that they were part of this revolutionary movement, it was also that they were just known about because of the excavations and the publication of the findings. So here the same painters who were painting the more revolutionary scenes were also painting scenes of Ani, and drawing attention to this medieval Armenian heritage. And there's this fantastic album that Fetvadzian created about the Ani excavations and then the ruins. Telemesian is an interesting character because he was brought up in Van, and he joined the Armenian party, and then later on he moved to St. Petersburg and was trained there, and also to Paris. So he has a sort of mixed education as an artist, and also a mixed social network and interaction with different groups and intellectuals. He was imprisoned for some amount of time because of his association with the revolutionary movement, and this is a portrait from his time in prison, which has been written about in an article by Gizem Tongo, which is available on that link on the slide. And she talks about how Telemesian went through this process of sort of radicalization because of his difficult experience being imprisoned, and he turns from an initial identity that was a much more hybrid Ottoman Armenian identity to a more radicalized Armenian revolutionary identity as a result of the hardships and the experiences that he suffered. So he starts to engage in much more overtly political subjects as time goes on. The shepherd from Lorry we already mentioned. A number of studies of Armenian medieval motifs. And then in 1915, Gizem Tongo draws attention to a number of paintings that he makes that are almost sort of serenely utopian, of Sipan Mountain from Knut's Island in the area of Lake Van. And at the time, Telemesian was actually participating in the siege Van that took place as part of the genocide. And so it's remarkable, really, that he turned his attention to this immensely beautiful landscape that has no trace of the bloodshed that was happening there at exactly that moment. And this is especially amazing given that he was an active participant, a hero of that activity. But he does also paint some images that do allude to the bloodshed that did happen, although this example, it's in the National Gallery of Armenia, it's not dated, but they've given a date of 1915 as a sort of speculative date. So it would be interesting to find out when it was painted. So I think we'll go more quickly through the Russian example, but there are a number of common themes that we will look at. I think we'll skip through the Persian context, only really to highlight that there was obviously this very hybrid Persian culture before the Russian occupation, which is represented by some monuments that remain, like the Blue Mosque, and also some monuments that don't remain, like those that were originally within the citadel, many of which were destroyed actually by the Russians. So we'll skip past this, except to mention that there was this hybrid identity, which is again represented by the dome painting of Echmidzin, which will remind you of the New Julfa dome that we saw last week from Persian Armenia. Like in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians had a really important role at the court of the Tsars. Already, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich was presented with the Almaty throne in 1660, which resulted in the 1667 trade treaty, including a monopoly over silk between Armenian merchants and the Russian throne. So there's a sort of parallel special relationship between the Russian Tsars and Armenian merchants that's taking place in the Russian Empire. As represented by this throne. Again, the Russian Empire was a very diverse empire, and so they had to engage in these imperial strategies in order to maintain control over the empire, and Armenians were absolutely crucial to this control, particularly because of their roles as elites and intermediaries between various populations and trade networks, but also as generals and other important roles. I already mentioned to some extent the role of Armenian merchants in relation to the imperial household, but it was also important to city life in the Russian Empire. And if you go to Tbilisi today, you'll be surrounded by former merchant houses that were once inhabited by wealthy Armenian merchants who were living in Tbilisi, or Tiflis as it was known. And one example is the Melik Azarian's house, which is this tremendous Art Nouveau mansion which is on the corner of one of the main thoroughfares in Tbilisi. And another example is the Ashakuni Palace, which was the home of merchants from the Vardan Ashakuni family, built in 1856. So it was in various urban centres throughout the Russian Empire that Armenian merchants were particularly important, not just to the trade, but also to the urban life and the architecture of these cities. And that this importance can still be seen today, although perhaps not everybody would know that these houses are Armenian houses. So the special relationship between the Tsar and the Armenian merchants and nobility is in some ways shown, I think, by the construction of the Armenian Church of St. Catherine, just off Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg in 1779. So if you walk down Nevsky Prospect, if you manage to glance to the side at the opportune moment, then you will see the Armenian church poking out. So this is the Nevsky Prospect, and this is the Armenian church. That is in quite a prominent location. Although it's not actually on Nevsky, you will not miss it, because it is quite a prominent corner just behind all the main government buildings, like the Palace Square, the Winter Palace, Mikhailovsky Palace, and all of these buildings. So just behind all of this area, off the side of Nevsky, so where is it? Somewhere down here, is the Armenian church. So in other words, I think this was quite a significant piece of real estate that the Armenian community was given at this time. And it's also shown through the architectural style. The patron was Ivan Lazarev, who was this very wealthy jeweler, who was the jeweler to Catherine the Great, and also advisor to some extent, one of her favourite courtiers. So the patron was him, who paid for the church to be built in 1779, and the architect was Georgi Felten, or Yuri Felten, who was a court architect to Catherine the Great, and who built some of her most important buildings, like the Cheshme Church. So it's interesting that not only the most important imperial architect built the Armenian church, but also there's some degree of overlap of style in terms of the polychrome exterior and the lavishness of the interior. Later it was restored, I think, quite considerably by Alexander Tamanyan in around 1908. So I'll just finish by discussing paintings in this context. So Armenian painters had been important in terms of serving Armenian high society under the Russians. So the merchants that I mentioned before in Tiflis and elsewhere, they had their portraits painted by Armenian painters, chief amongst which were the Hovnatanian family. And there's a wonderful film that Sergei Parajanov made about the Hovnatanian family, which I recommend that you find on YouTube. And the Hovnatanians not only painted the merchants, but they also painted important Armenian generals, and they also painted some national subjects, like the Catholicos Nerses Ashcharaketsi, who I can't pronounce, and Tiridates III here, and Haik, the Armenian sort of forefather, is here. You also see this interesting transformation in style under, in the example of Ayvazovsky. Ayvazovsky was primarily known as the sort of naval sea painter and servant to the Tsars, and sort of publicizing Russian imperial might through his naval painting that made you awe at the splendor of the landscapes, but also the naval capacity. But he increasingly paints views of Armenian related subjects, like this romantic view of Tiflis or Constantinople. And again, in the 1880s and 1890s, as things became more and more difficult for the Armenian community, he turns his attention more to Armenian-related subjects, like Descent of Noah from Ararat from 1889, Catholicos Rimian from 1895, and a picture of Gregory the Illuminator from 1892. And there's a wonderful article again by Vazken Davidian on his portrayal of the Trebizond massacres and how Ayvazovsky manipulated this painting to completely change how the massacres happened. So he made this dramatic sea scene instead of communicating how the massacres happened on land, because not only was he this tremendous sea painter, but also he thought this would be more striking for the visitors to the exhibition to view, and so they would feel more pathos for the plight of the Armenians if it was portrayed in a more dramatic manner. So I think we'll just finish with that because we've already discussed Ptolemasian. I was going to discuss Bashan-Jaghian, but I think probably you're all familiar with him and his images of Mount Ararat. So again, Ararat becomes a more and more important symbol of Armenian nationhood through painting, particularly around 1910s under painters like Bashan-Jaghian.